Megan Drake did not speak for 7 years, 4 months, and 12 days inside that concrete Oklahoma hellhole. Then, on a freezing November morning, 3 days before Thanksgiving, she walked up to Warden Robert Holloway during routine inspection. She leaned close enough that he could smell the prison laundry bleach baked permanently into her skin and hair. She whispered 3 words so quietly that the security camera footage later showed only her lips barely moving at all. Check cell 14. 4 minutes later, North Fork Correctional Facility went into full emergency lockdown and has 1,200 inmates frozen in place instantly. What they found under the mattress in that empty cell was a hand-drawn map of every underground tunnel beneath the prison. And next to it lay a list of 6 correctional officers by name and a single date circled 3 times in red ink. That date was tomorrow. What you are about to hear destroyed careers, exposed a conspiracy, and forced an entire state to ask who really belongs behind bars. If this story grips you the way it gripped me, drop your answer in the comments. Would you have stayed silent for 7 years? The alarm hit Block B like a physical wall of sound, slamming every woman flat against the nearest concrete surface they could find. 1,400 watts of emergency sirens bounced off cinder block walls, turning the air itself into something that vibrated inside your chest cavity. Megan stood perfectly still in the corridor, while 237 women around her dropped to their knees screaming. She did not flinch because she had been waiting for this exact moment for 2,691 days of silence. Guards in riot gear thundered past her, their boots cracking against the polished floor like gunshots echoing through a canyon in winter. She pressed her back against the wall and watched them run toward cell 14 at the far end of the east wing. Her face showed nothing at all. Not relief, not fear, not satisfaction, just the blank gray patience of someone who had already survived worse. Warden Holloway stood at the command center watching 12 monitors flicker between camera feeds, his coffee growing cold in his hand, untouched. He kept replaying those 3 whispered words in his mind, trying to understand why a ghost had suddenly decided to speak after 7 years. Something in her eyes when she said it told him that cell 14 was only the door, and behind it waited something much larger. Cell 14 belonged to an inmate named Carla Ruiz, who had been transferred to the medical wing 6 days ago with a kidney infection. On paper, the cell should have been sealed and tagged for sanitation, but someone had accessed it 11 times in the past week alone. The electronic lock log showed entry codes belonging to 3 different correctional officers, each one accessing the cell between 2 and 4 in the morning. Holloway stared at the map they pulled from under the mattress, and his stomach dropped because it was accurate down to the inch markings. Every maintenance tunnel, every drainage pipe, every electrical conduit was drawn with the precision of someone who had access to architectural blueprints. The list of 6 names included officers he saw every single day, people he trusted with keys to every door in this facility. He turned the paper over and found a second drawing showing the armory location with a red X marking the ventilation shaft directly above it. His hands were steady because 20 years of military discipline do not vanish, but the vein in his temple was pulsing visibly beneath the skin. He picked up the internal phone line and called Lieutenant Derek Page, head of security for the night shift, to report immediately to command. The line rang 4 times and then went to voicemail, and Holloway felt something cold settle into the base of his spine like ice water. Megan sat in interview room C, which was just a concrete box with a metal table bolted to the floor and 1 fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The room smelled like sweat and disinfectant, the same way every room in North Fork smelled, because misery has a very specific chemical signature. Holloway walked in alone, which was against protocol, but he had already decided that protocol was not going to solve what was happening here. He sat down across from her and placed the map and the list flat on the table between them, like a dealer showing cards. Megan looked at the documents and looked at him, and her gray-green eyes held the expression of someone calculating a price in real time. She did not speak first because 7 years had taught her that silence is the only currency that appreciates in value behind these walls. Holloway leaned forward and said, "Tell me everything you know right now, Megan, because we have less than 24 hours before whatever this is." She tilted her head slightly to the left, the way a bird does when it hears something interesting buried deep beneath the surface. Then she said one sentence that changed the entire geometry of the conversation and everything that would follow after it tonight. "I will tell you one name right now, and the rest after you make a phone call to Oklahoma Department of Human Services about my daughter." Holloway blinked twice because of all the things he expected her to demand. A phone call about a child was not anywhere on his list. He had read her file before walking in here and knew she had a daughter named Lily, taken into state custody 8 years ago at age 3. The file said, Megan Elaine Drake, convicted of possession with intent to distribute 400 grams of fentanyl, sentenced to 15 years at North Fork. On it said nothing about a daughter who would now be 11 years old, somewhere in the foster care labyrinth of Oklahoma State Services. Megan watched him process this information, and she could see the exact moment when he understood that she was not negotiating from weakness. She was negotiating from the only position of strength a prisoner ever truly has, which is knowing something that the people with keys desperately need. Holloway rubbed his face with both hands and exhaled through his nose the way men do when they realize the situation is already beyond their control. He said, "I can make a call, but I need something real first, Megan, because I have 1,200 women locked down and a conspiracy under my roof." She nodded once and said the name quietly, like she was handing him a loaded weapon with the safety off and the barrel still warm. "Officer Daniel Briggs, Block D night shift. Check his locker, and you will find enough fentanyl to kill every woman in this building, twice over." They found Briggs in the break room eating a turkey sandwich like it was any other Tuesday night shift at a correctional facility in rural Oklahoma. 2 guards escorted him to a holding room, while a third opened his locker with bolt cutters because Briggs suddenly could not remember his combination. Inside, they found 14 amber prescription bottles filled with pharmaceutical-grade fentanyl patches worth roughly $40,000 on the prison black market. 3 prepaid burner phones were taped to the inside of the locker door, each one containing text messages in a code that would take days to crack. Bob Briggs sat in the holding room and stared at the wall for 11 minutes without saying a single word to anyone who asked him questions. Then he looked directly at the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling and said something that made Holloway grab the edge of the desk. "Ask Lieutenant Page who hired me, and you will understand why that woman in Block B has been silent for 7 goddamn years straight." The words hung in the air of the command center like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell, but nobody could yet locate precisely. Holloway turned slowly to the monitor showing the security office where Lieutenant Derek Page should have been sitting at his desk coordinating the lockdown response. Fourth, the chair was empty, and the screen on his computer was dark, and the coffee mug on his desk was still steaming, which meant he had been there minutes ago. Page was not in the security office, because Page was already 3 moves ahead, executing a contingency plan he had built over 4 years of patient preparation. He stood in the basement corridor near the laundry facility, speaking into one of his own burner phones, telling someone on the other end that the timeline had just been accelerated significantly. Above him, 1,200 women sat locked in their cells, and most of them had no idea that the real danger was not the lockdown itself. The real danger wore a correctional officer badge, had a commendation for distinguished service framed on his office wall, and coached Little League baseball on weekends. Lieutenant Page had arrived at North Fork 3 years after Megan was convicted, and that timing was not coincidental. It was architectural and deliberately calculated for control. He had followed her here because Megan Drake was the only living person who had seen him distribute stolen opioids from the Tulsa clinic where she once worked. Back then, he was Officer Derek Page of the Tulsa Police Department. and she was a nursing student working night shifts as a medical assistant, earning $11. He had planted 400 grams of fentanyl in her Honda Civic, called it in himself, and testified with the calm authority of a decorated police officer against her. Now, 8 years later, he worked 30 feet from her cell, and she had never said a word about it until tonight, when everything changed. But Megan did not know the worst part yet, and when she found out that it would break something inside her, that 7 years of prison had failed to crack. Holloway made the call to Oklahoma Department of Human Services at 11:47 p.m. from his office, with the door locked and the blinds drawn shut. A night supervisor named Patricia answered, and Holloway identified himself, gave his badge number, and asked about the current placement of Lily Marie Drake. Patricia put him on hold for 4 minutes, during which Holloway listened to hold music that sounded like it was recorded inside a coffin filled with cheap synthesizers. When Patricia came back, her voice had changed from bored to careful, the way voices change when someone finds something in a file that does not look right. She said Lily Marie Drake was adopted 3 years ago by a family in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and the adoption was finalized through an expedited process. Holloway asked for the name of the adoptive family, and Patricia hesitated for 6 seconds, which in bureaucratic time is the equivalent of a full-blown panic attack. She said the adoptive parents were listed as Derek and Amanda Page of 1422 Maple Ridge Drive in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma County of Tulsa. Holloway did not move for a very long time after he hung up the phone, because his body had temporarily forgotten how to perform basic motor functions. The man who framed Megan Drake had adopted her daughter, and Megan had been sitting 30 feet away from him for 3 years, not knowing this truth. He walked back to interview room C, where Megan sat exactly as he had left her, hands flat on the metal table, eyes fixed on the middle distance. He sat down and he tried to find the right words, but there are no right words for what he was about to say to this woman. He said, "Megan, I found your daughter, and she is alive, and she is healthy, and she is in the 5th grade at a school in Broken Arrow." Megan's eyes shifted to his face, and for the first time in the conversation, he saw something moving behind them, like water under ice beginning to crack. He said the family that adopted her 3 years ago is listed under the name Page, and then he stopped because he could not finish the sentence. He did not need to finish it because Megan's face told him that her body had understood the information before her conscious mind had fully processed the words. She stopped breathing, and her pupils dilated until the gray-green of her irises was almost entirely swallowed by black, and her fingers curled slowly inward. 1 second passed in silence, then 2, then 3, and the fluorescent light above them buzzed like something alive and trapped and desperate. Then Megan Drake uncurled her fingers, placed her palms flat on the table again, and spoke in a voice so level, so empty, so terrifyingly calm. "Now I will tell you everything, and you will write it down, because tomorrow Derek Page is going to try to kill me and burn this place to the ground." Megan talked for 47 minutes straight, and Holloway filled 11 pages of legal pad with handwriting that grew worse each minute. She described a network that used North Fork's medical wing as a distribution hub for pharmaceutical opioids across 3 entire states. Every shipment came in disguised as routine medical supplies, ordered through a shell company that Page had registered under his wife's name. The prison pharmacy received twice the fentanyl patches it needed, and the surplus vanished into a pipeline that fed street dealers in Tulsa. Megan knew this because she had watched Page build the identical system 8 years ago at the Tulsa clinic where she mopped floors. She explained how Page recruited correctional officers by identifying the ones drowning in debt or divorce or addiction, because broken people make obedient tools. 6 officers on that list were not conspirators by choice, but prisoners themselves, trapped by blackmail and fear of exposure from within. Holloway stopped writing when Megan described the bunt plan because the word bunt did not capture what Page had actually designed here. It was not an escape, and it was not a riot. It was a controlled demolition meant to destroy evidence and one specific witness forever. The witness was sitting across from Holloway right now, with her palms flat on the table and her voice steady as a surgical instrument. But here is what Megan did not tell Holloway, and what she could not have known, because some traps are invisible until they close. Mr. Page had spent 4 years building redundancies into his operation, the way a military engineer builds backup detonators into every single explosive charge. If one officer got caught, the others would accelerate, and if the warden discovered the map, the timeline would simply compress like a spring. At that exact moment, Page stood in the basement corridor making 3 phone calls to 3 different officers positioned across 3 separate housing blocks. Each one received the same 4-word message in a code they had rehearsed 17 times during overnight shifts in empty corridors together. The bunt was not scheduled for tomorrow anymore, because tomorrow had just become tonight, and tonight was already half over and ticking down. From above them, 1,200 women slept or pretended to sleep, while the architecture of catastrophe assembled itself quietly beneath their concrete floors. Megan was giving Holloway the blueprint of yesterday's plan, but Page had already drawn a new one in the last 40 minutes alone. The gap between what Megan knew and what was actually happening right now was exactly wide enough for someone to die inside of it. Holloway did not know this yet, but his body knew because the vein in his temple had not stopped pulsing since he sat down. Tanya Washington lay on her bunk in Block B Cell 31, listening to the lockdown silence, which was never actually silent at all. She could hear 200 women breathing through concrete walls, and the sound was like an ocean trapped inside a box made of stone. Tanya had survived 15 years inside North Fork by reading vibrations the way a spider reads its web for the slightest disturbance anywhere. Tonight, the web was humming with a frequency she had never felt before, and it made the hair on her forearms stand straight up. She knew about the bunt because the organizers had approached her 6 months ago, offering a guaranteed exit through the drainage tunnels beneath Block D. She had said yes because 15 years is long enough to kill the part of your brain that calculates risk versus reward with any accuracy. But then Megan had whispered those 3 words to the warden, and the lockdown had slammed down like a guillotine blade on everything planned. Tanya understood immediately that Megan had just painted a target on her own back, large enough to see from every cell block simultaneously. The question was not whether someone would come for Megan tonight, because that was already certain, as gravity pulling objects toward the hard ground. The question was whether Tanya Washington would stand between that gravity and the only person who ever stitched her wounds shut. At 12:34 a.m., a correctional officer named Sandra Voss unlocked Block B's shower room door using an override code that should not exist. Voss was not on the list of 6 names found under the mattress because Page had kept her separate as insurance for exactly this situation. She walked through the darkened shower room, checking each stall with a flashlight beam that cut through steam still lingering from evening hours. In her right hand, she carried a sharpened piece of metal rebar wrapped in athletic tape that she had pulled from a maintenance closet downstairs. Her orders were simple and specific: find Megan Drake and make it look like an inmate altercation that escalated during the chaos of lockdown tonight. Voss had worked at North Fork for 2 years, and she owed Page $40,000 in gambling debts that he had purchased from a collection agency. She was not a killer by nature, but debt has a way of rewriting your moral source code one compromise at a time until nothing remains. The shower room security camera had been redirected to loop footage from 6 p.m., which meant whatever happened here would be invisible completely. Voss did not know that Tanya Washington had been watching the corridor through the narrow window slot of her cell door for 3 hours straight. Tanya had seen Voss walk past with something metallic catching the emergency lighting, and she knew exactly what that shape meant at this hour. Tanya moved through the cell block with a silence that seemed physically impossible for a woman who weighed 231 pounds of solid muscle. She had learned to walk without sound during her first year, when noise after lights out meant a guard's baton across your kidneys without warning. She reached the shower room door 17 seconds after Voss entered, and she could hear boots moving across a wet tile inside the room. Tanya did not have a weapon because she did not need one since her hands had broken a woman's jaw in 2014. She pushed the door open, and the hinges screamed like a living thing, and Voss spun around with the rebar raised above her head. What happened next took less than 8 seconds, but those 8 seconds contained more violence than most people experience in their entire natural lives. Tanya caught the rebar on her left forearm, and the bone did not break, but the pain was white and total, and it filled her vision completely. She drove her right fist into the center of Voss's chest, and the officer folded like a paper structure hit by wind, moving at incredible speed. Voss hit the tile floor, and the rebar clattered away, spinning into a drain grate where it lodged between the metal bars with a sound. Tanya stood over her, breathing hard with blood running down her left arm, and she said one sentence that Voss would remember for years afterward. "Or tell Page that Block B belongs to me, and the next person he sends will leave on a stretcher going straight to the county morgue." Tanya locked Voss inside the shower room, using the same override code that Voss herself had used to enter just 3 minutes before tonight. Then she walked back to her cell, leaving a trail of blood drops on the polished concrete floor that looked like ellipsis dots in a sentence unfinished. In her cell, she wrapped her forearm with a torn bedsheet and bit down on her mattress until the worst of the pain became something manageable. She had just made her choice, and the choice was Megan, and there was no taking it back, because loyalty in prison is a one-way door forever. 3 cells down, Megan lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, and she did not know what Tanya had just done for her in that shower room. She was thinking about a girl with gray-green eyes in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, who called a corrupt cop daddy and had no idea who she was. The thought was a knife that twisted every time Megan breathed, and she let it twist because pain was the only thing keeping her focused now. Somewhere below her feet, she could feel vibrations through the concrete that should not have been there at 1:30 in the morning during full lockdown. The building itself was trying to tell her something, and Megan pressed her palm flat against the cold floor and listened with her whole body. Rachel Kim had been locked inside the administrative wing for 6 hours, and she had spent 5 of those hours doing what lawyers do best. She searched filing cabinets that nobody had organized properly since 2019, pulling folders and cross-referencing inmate numbers against court documents systematically. She found Megan Drake's file in the 3rd cabinet, wedged between 2 folders that had been deliberately misfiled to make discovery almost impossible. The arrest report listed the primary witness as Officer Derek Page, badge number 7743 of the Tulsa Police Department Narcotics Division specifically. Rachel read that name and then looked at the staff directory pinned to the bulletin board 6 feet away from where she was sitting right now. Lieutenant Derek Page, head of security, North Fork Correctional Facility, employee identification number matching the same man who had testified against Megan Drake. Rachel's hands began to shake, not from fear, but from the specific adrenaline that hits when you realize you are holding a bomb made of paper. She tried the internal phone system to reach Holloway, but the line routed through the security office, which meant Page controlled every internal communication channel. The external phone lines had been cut when the lockdown initiated, which was standard protocol, but suddenly felt like a cage door closing around her specifically. Rachel looked at the filing cabinet, and then at the window, and then at the server room door at the end of the hallway, and began to plan. The server room was locked with a keypad code, but Rachel had watched the administrative assistant type it in that morning without realizing anyone was paying attention. 4771 enter, and the door clicked open, revealing a room full of humming machines and blinking lights that smelled like warm plastic. Rachel found the external communication terminal and realized that the lockdown had disabled outgoing calls, but not the automated emergency broadcast system buried in settings. If she triggered a federal distress signal, it would bypass every internal system and reach the U.S. Marshals Service in Oklahoma City within 90 seconds. But triggering it would also alert everyone inside the facility, including Paige, that someone had accessed the server room from the administrative wing tonight. Rachel stood in front of the terminal with her finger hovering over the key, and she thought about Megan Drake sitting in a cell somewhere in this building. She thought about the file in her hand that proved a police officer had framed an innocent woman and then followed her to prison like a predator. She thought about the daughter who had been taken and adopted by the very man who destroyed her mother's life with manufactured evidence. Rachel Kim was 29 years old, and she had gone to law school because she believed the system could be fixed from the inside with enough effort. She pressed the key, and somewhere in Oklahoma City, a red light began to flash on a screen that nobody had expected to see activated tonight. Paige received the federal distress signal alert on his burner phone exactly 11 seconds after Rachel pressed that key in the server room. The system he had built was designed to monitor every electronic pulse moving through North Fork's infrastructure like a nervous system watching itself. He stood in the basement corridor and smiled because panic makes people predictable, and predictable people are the easiest to destroy completely. He made 3 final calls to 3 officers stationed in blocks B, C, and D, telling each one the same coded phrase. The phrase was, "Thanksgiving came early," and it meant abandon the original timeline and execute everything right now before the marshals arrived tonight. Each officer had a specific role rehearsed 17 times, and each one began moving through darkened corridors toward predetermined positions within the facility. Paige calculated 43 minutes before federal marshals could drive from Oklahoma City to this facility in rural Sayre, Oklahoma, at maximum speed. 43 minutes was enough time to destroy the medical wing records, ignite the pharmacy storage, and eliminate one specific witness permanently from existence. He walked toward Block B with his service weapon drawn and his badge catching the emergency lights like a small metal mirror reflecting nothing. But Paige had miscalculated one variable, and that variable weighed 231 pounds and had a tattoo reading Psalm 23. The first explosion came from the pharmacy storage room at 12:51 a.m., and it sounded like God had slammed a door shut forever. Chemical accelerant had been placed inside the ventilation shaft 3 days ago by an officer named Rawlings, who was number 4 on the list. The fire suppression system activated, but someone had replaced the extinguishing agent with water, which spread the chemical fire faster across surfaces. Smoke began filling the east corridor within 90 seconds, turning the air into something thick and gray and impossible to breathe through safely. 1,200 women started screaming simultaneously, and the sound was unlike anything Holloway had ever heard, including 2 combat deployments overseas. He grabbed the emergency radio and called for all available guards to evacuate Block A nearest the pharmacy, but half his guards answered directly to Paige. The ones who answered his call moved toward Block A, and the ones who belonged to Paige moved toward Block B, where Megan was locked inside. Holloway realized in that moment that he did not know which half of his own staff was loyal and which half was compromised entirely. He had spent 5 years trusting a system that had been hollowed out from the inside like a tree rotting beneath bark that still looked perfectly healthy. The smoke was spreading, and the clock was ticking, and somewhere in this building, a woman who knew everything was completely unprotected right now. Megan felt the explosion through the floor before she heard it, because concrete transmits vibration faster than air, carries sound waves. She rolled off her bunk and pressed herself flat against the cell door, listening to the chaos erupting throughout the entire housing block. She could hear cell doors opening electronically, which should have been impossible during lockdown unless someone had accessed the master override system. Women poured into the corridor, some running toward exits, and others running toward enemies they had been waiting months to reach violently. Megan stayed inside her cell because she understood something that panic made everyone else forget in moments like this one tonight. The safest place during a controlled demolition is the one spot the demolition team assumes you have already left behind and abandoned completely. She pushed her bunk against the cell door, creating a barricade that would buy maybe 90 seconds against someone determined to enter forcefully. Then she crouched in the corner farthest from the door and waited with her hands flat on the concrete floor, feeling every vibration. The vibrations told her footsteps were approaching, heavy and deliberate, and wearing boots that correctional officers wear on standard night shifts here. But these boots were not running toward the exits like everyone else, and they were heading directly toward her cell with purpose. Tanya intercepted the first officer outside cell 47 using nothing but her body weight and the element of complete tactical surprise from darkness. Officer Rawlings hit the wall so hard that the cinder block cracked behind his skull and he slid down, leaving a red smear. Tanya took his radio and his baton, and she kept moving because she knew Rawlings was not the one Paige sent specifically for Megan tonight. The corridor was filling with smoke now, and women were coughing and stumbling, and some were fighting each other over absolutely nothing meaningful at all. Tanya moved against the current like a boulder in a river, letting the stream of bodies break around her massive frame without slowing down. She reached Megan's cell and saw the bunk pushed against the door, and she pounded twice with her open palm, a signal they never discussed. But Megan recognized the weight and rhythm of that hand because 7 years teaches you to identify every person by their smallest movements. The bunk scraped back and the door opened, and Megan looked at Tanya's blood-soaked arm and the baton in her right hand gripped tightly. Tanya said 2 words that contained more loyalty than most marriage vows spoken in churches across the entire state of Oklahoma ever do. "Wettest," she said, "stay close," and then they moved together into the smoke-filled corridor toward the one place Paige would never expect them going. They moved toward the fire, not away from it, because Megan understood that Paige's officers were sweeping Block B from the exits inward. Going toward the pharmacy meant going toward the one section that Paige's men had already cleared and written off as destroyed beyond access. The smoke was so thick that Megan could not see Tanya's back 3 feet ahead of her, but she followed the sound of breathing. They passed women lying on the corridor floor, some unconscious from smoke, and others simply frozen in terror, unable to move their own bodies. Megan stopped at each one, pressing 2 fingers to their necks, checking pulses the way she had learned in nursing school before everything ended. Tanya pulled her forward each time because stopping meant dying, and Megan's medical instincts were going to get them both killed tonight. They reached the junction between Block B and the East Medical Corridor, where the air was hotter but paradoxically clearer near the ceiling. Megan pointed up, and Tanya understood immediately, because survival makes translators out of people who share the same desperate language of staying alive. They crouched low beneath the smoke layer and moved through the medical corridor toward the administrative wing where neither of them knew Rachel existed. But someone else was already in that corridor, and he had been waiting for exactly this route because Paige knew Megan better than she realized. Paige stood at the far end of the medical corridor with his weapon drawn and the emergency lights casting his shadow 40 feet long across the floor. He had predicted that Megan would move toward the fire because he had studied her for 3 years and understood how her mind processed threat assessment. She was not a woman who ran from danger, because running from danger was what got her caught and convicted 8 years ago in Tulsa. He had counted on this and positioned himself at the only choke point between Block B and the administrative wing where escape routes converged. When he saw 2 figures emerge from the smoke, one massive and one thin, he raised his weapon and called out her name like greeting an old friend. Megan stopped and Tanya stepped in front of her, and Paige laughed because the geometry of the situation was almost poetically simple for him now. He said, "Megan, you should have stayed quiet because silence was the only thing keeping you alive in this place all these years here." Megan stepped out from behind Tanya because she was tired of hiding behind other people's bodies and other people's sacrifices and other people's broken bones. She looked at the man who stole her freedom and then stole her daughter. And she felt something colder than fear filling her chest completely. She said, "I know about Lily," and Paige's weapon hand dropped exactly 1 inch, which in a standoff is the distance between control and catastrophe. That 1 inch was all Tanya needed, because she had been reading body language for 15 years, the way a predator reads the muscle tension of prey. She threw the baton sidearm, and it struck Paige's wrist with a crack that echoed through the corridor like a branch snapping under heavy ice. The weapon discharged into the ceiling, sending concrete dust raining down like gray snow falling inside a building that was already burning from within. Paige stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, and Tanya closed the distance in 3 steps that covered 15 feet of corridor in under 2 seconds flat. She hit him once in the solar plexus, and he folded, and she hit him again across the jaw, and he spun into the wall hard. Now Megan did not watch the violence, because her eyes were fixed on something behind Paige that he had not noticed in the smoke-filled corridor. A door had opened at the far end, and Rachel Kim stood there, holding a stack of files with Megan's name printed across every single tab. 3 women stood in that corridor, surrounded by smoke and fire, and the unconscious body of a man who had destroyed all their lives differently. Rachel looked at Megan, and Megan looked at Rachel, and something passed between them that did not require any words to communicate clearly tonight. It was recognition between 2 women who understood that the system was not broken, because broken implies it once worked properly for people like them. Holloway found them there 7 minutes later with 4 loyal guards and a fire extinguisher that was already running on its last pressurized reserves. Paige was zip-tied on the floor with Tanya sitting on his legs, reading the tattoo on her own neck aloud, like a prayer for everyone present. Rachel handed Holloway the files and explained in 90 seconds what had taken her 6 hours to piece together from misfiled cabinet documents alone. The federal distress signal had been received and confirmed, and U.S. Marshals were 17 minutes out, according to the automated system response timestamp. Holloway looked at Megan, who was leaning against the wall with smoke stains on her face and her hands finely trembling after hours of stillness. He wanted to say something meaningful, but meaningful words felt obscene inside a building where the air itself tasted like burning pharmaceutical chemicals tonight. Instead, he took off his jacket and handed it to her, because she was shivering, and it was November in Oklahoma and concrete holds cold forever. Megan took the jacket and put it on, and it smelled like coffee and aftershave, and a world outside these walls she had almost forgotten existed entirely. The sirens in the distance were getting louder, which meant help was coming, but Megan knew that help and justice are 2 very different things altogether. She had given them everything, and now the only question left was whether everything she gave would be enough to bring her daughter home.